What we do here matters, because what we don't do matters even more.
We need to continue to push, and we at ADAO are going to continue to push the Surgeon General of the United States.
As you know, the United States continues to use asbestos, and that indeed is a barrier to others stopping its use.
The most horrific part of this whole story is that it is preventable.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank Linda and ADAO for inviting me to talk about something I'm extremely passionate about, as you all have your passion, which is why you're here. And mine is helping to advocate for clinical trials and raise awareness for clinical trials. So I'm picking up on a couple of the themes here, I think. So I just wanted to provide you with a little bit of an overview to help you understand clinical trials maybe a little bit better. For many of you, I realize that some of this is going to not be new information, but I hope you'll still be able to get a little something new out of it anyway. And for others of you, it may be very new information. So just so that we're, whoops, okay, there we go. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I just wanted to start with a couple of definitions. And the first definition is of clinical research. Basically, clinical research is research on human beings. That's the bottom line. That's why it's called clinical. So this could, most often, is patient-oriented research. So we're looking at mechanisms of diseases, developing therapeutic interventions, we're looking at developing new technologies. But clinical research can also be epidemiologic in nature, behavioral, it can be focused on outcomes as well as health services. So clinical trials is one type of clinical research that really looks at answering specific questions about interventions. And these interventions can be drugs, devices, it could be some type of change in behavior, and it really is looking at trying to develop something that's safe and effective. There are several types of clinical trials. Prevention trials obviously look at preventing a disease or a condition from happening. Screening, looking at being able to more early screen for diseases or conditions. Diagnostic trials, looking at actually helping to aid with improvement in early diagnosis, or even in once you have a condition, if you're using some kind of something either radiographically or even through blood samplings to be able to diagnose the disease, see how the treatment's working. And then there's treatment clinical trials, which is sort of the bulk of what sort of my experience has been. I've been involved in research for about 20 years, so and doing a lot of early drug development trials. So treatment trials are really what I think many of us want to learn a little bit more about today even. And then there's other clinical trials looking at controlling symptoms or trying to focus on quality of life specific issues. So where do we get ideas for clinical trials from? As I was listening to the keynote this morning, earlier, I was thinking, okay, well, we already have a lot of questions that we can think about asking. So we can get ideas from clinical trials by attending conferences and talking with each other. We can get ideas for clinical trials from our basic science, our laboratory research. We can certainly get questions or clinical trial ideas from previous clinical trials, building upon what we are learning about an intervention. Healthcare providers clearly are a source of ideas. And then there's our patients. I don't think that we always think about listening to the voice of the patient and what they're asking. Why am I so sick? And the person next to me who has the same type of cancer is getting the same regimen, isn't as sick as I am. And that is looking at some of that personalized health care. So our patients can help us generate ideas as well. So the impact of clinical trials, really, it's getting those research results. It's trying to develop then some guidelines and getting those guidelines into standard of practice. And ultimately, we're looking at improving the health and wellness of human beings. In certainly the cancer arena especially, we're looking at having them live longer and live without their disease, or with their disease being controlled, and looking at then improving quality of life. Some of you all may that pay attention in the media, certainly we've had a lot about drug recalls. We've had a lot about drugs being taken off the market or off the market for certain indications. And that really happens in this concept of these phases of drug development, or phases of clinical trials, intervention trials. And so I just wanted to quickly highlight what those differences were. So a phase 1 clinical trial is a first-in-human clinical trial, and it looks at determining the safe dose. Sometimes it's also taking drugs that aren't first in human and using them together to come up with a new standard of care or a new treatment regimen. But the goal is always looking at what's a safe dosing. What's the safe dose to give, or what schedule? Do we give it once a day, twice a day, once a week, or once every 3 weeks? Phase 2 clinical trials builds upon that knowledge and adds to it looking at the activity for the particular disease or indication that you want to study. And then phase 3 clinical trials really become the gold standard. They're usually the randomized controlled clinical trials comparing a potentially new gold standard of care with the current existing standard of care. So there are some myths about clinical trials, though, and the media doesn't always portray clinical trials necessarily in a particularly positive light, if you will. So the one myth that I really would like to dispel is that clinical trials are a last-ditch effort for somebody, and they're not at all. They're available to healthy individuals with no evidence of any type of disease. They're available to people that are at high risk for developing a particular disease or condition. And they also look at going across the healthcare continuum from, illness, hopefully to wellness, back to illness. So at any point in time, any one of us can donate a tube of blood to look for some particular genetic marker as an indication or an indicator for a disease or a condition. So really, clinical trials are not a last-ditch effort, and certainly clinical research is not a last-ditch effort. And we do look at all ages and all conditions. So there are benefits for being on clinical trials. It allows patients to be the first to potentially benefit from an intervention, and also gives patients or research participants, I'm a nurse, so everybody's a patient to me, but a research participant, a chance to help others as well. And there's certainly, no one can argue that there are risks. The treatment being studied may not be as good as standard of care. We certainly do not know what types of side effects, adverse experiences the research participants or patients are going to experience. And we also do have the issue of health insurance, certainly at least here in this country, and participation in clinical trials, which hopefully with healthcare reform, we will see that potential barrier to be slightly eliminated. Not fully, but slightly. But that is also a consideration, is looking at that third-party reimbursement. There have been many surveys done related to clinical trial participation and barriers and strategies, as well as some very well-designed clinical research studies themselves. But here in the United States, 94% of the American public says that their doctors have never posed a clinical trial or a clinical research study as any kind of a treatment option or any kind of an option for them at all. The American public recognizes that clinical trials are important, but yet their physicians are not really offering that. 74% have no real knowledge about what the clinical research process is about. 98% do not know where or how to identify or evaluate the appropriateness of clinical studies. So that means only 2% do. So we have a huge amount of public awareness for clinical trials that we need, certainly those who advocate for clinical trials need to be working on. And there are several grassroots initiatives that have developed over the past 5 to 10 years that are trying to focus on some of those ideas. Most common areas for physicians to refer for clinical trials is in cardiology, oncology, and psychology. So if you're not in those 3 top disease areas, then you're less likely to have a physician recommend a clinical trial. And about 4% of the physicians in the United States have actually been an investigator on a clinical trial. So we have a very small participation of physicians here that actually are involved in clinical trials. And only about 10% of adults have ever participated in a clinical trial. In pediatrics, we seem to do quite a bit better, especially in pediatric cancers. We do quite a bit better with enrollment. But yet, everybody who's participated, about 70 to 75%, actually have had a good experience. So it's not, a negative in that sense. The main reasons for not participating certainly is risk, the unknown risk without a known benefit. Patients really do have a fear of being a guinea pig, and I think that's where sometimes the media does not help. There was a Time magazine front page of a person literally sitting in a cage in 2002, I believe it came out, and it was, do I want to be a guinea pig? So I think that the whole public's perception of clinical trials really needs to be shifted. Patients also have a fear of receiving a placebo, so not being able to get something that works or might work. And placebos are used often, but in certain diseases, and cancer is one of those, where we generally do not use placebos. And if we do, we design the study such that the patient will get an active type of a drug. But certainly health risks is a huge reason why they don't participate. I think we need to make sure that we all understand that though there are risks, we do have layers of protection that we afford participants on clinical trials. We have societal protections. We have ethical principles that help guide clinical research and clinical trials. We have laws. We have regulations from the Food and Drug Administration here, and Health and Human Services Office of Human Research Protection that look at specifically protecting participants on clinical trials. We have organizational levels of protection where an organization looks at how sound the science is. The Ethical Review Board, whether you know it by an IRB, which is an institutional review board, or an ethics review committee, they look at the ethics and evaluate that. And then at an individual level, we have the informed consent process, where you're voluntarily agreeing to participate in a clinical trial, and you can stop your participation at any time. And I think that those layers of protection, I think, are not as publicly known. And I think that's why we have such a problem with enrollment in clinical trials. And in cancer, it's projected or estimated that 20% of all adult patients with cancer are eligible for a clinical trial, and less than 3% actually participate. So if we could get 10% of the 20% to participate, maybe we could get answers to some of our questions a little bit faster. There are some patient education tools that certainly are used in clinical trials, and one of the main ones is the actual informed consent document or other information sheets about a clinical research study. There's also information on a variety of websites, which I'll share in a few slides, for patients and healthcare providers to learn more about clinical trials. There are some questions to ask your physician as well, which we'll talk about in a second, and then I'll just end with some web-based resources. So there are some questions that patients considering participating on a clinical trial need to think about asking their healthcare team. This isn't just geared towards physicians. Nurses need to know about clinical trials as well. And for the healthcare team to be able to be proactive to anticipate of what to include in those discussions, and you can see some of them here. Why is the clinical trial being done? Is this for a curative intent? Is this for a palliative intent? What tests or procedures are going to be involved? What are the risks that are associated with participation? And again, that reinforcing of, do I have the right to stop if I want to? Specifics about the clinical trial, things like how long is it going to last? Maybe the trial is a finite period of time. And what if you're benefiting from that clinical trial? What if your symptoms are being well controlled? Is the trial still going to end at a certain time point? There's also looking at other choices and making sure that you know what your choices are before participating or thinking about participating on clinical trials. I talked a little bit about costs, but it's not just the third-party reimbursement. Many people don't go on a clinical trial alone. They bring someone with them. They may be missing work. There's travel expenses, things like that. They're hidden costs associated with clinical trials. And then what's the impact on daily life going to be? I know I'm getting a little pressed for time here. So in terms of the other thing that I think that any patients who are thinking about going on clinical trials or healthcare team members need to know about is what are the patient's responsibilities when they go on a clinical trial, and that they need to stay in regular contact with that research team as well as with their other healthcare team. They need to know who to call. They need to know when to call. They need to make sure that all of the physicians that are taking care of them, all of those healthcare providers, are aware that they are on a clinical trial. And they need to know to, follow sort of the schema of the study. There are some resources that are available. NIH has a nice overview research in clinical trials in you. There's actually information as well as some stories from patients as well as research team members. They're searching for a clinical trial. Anybody can go and search for a clinical trial on clinicaltrials.gov. The majority of trials are now being registered there, especially if the investigators want to be published. They need to register their clinical trials. And when you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you'll see an advanced search feature. And in that advanced search feature, you can put many, many types of criteria. You can look by disease, you can look by state, you can look by physician, things like that. So it's a great search engine, not just looking for cancer, but really for looking anything. And it includes observational, so non-clinical trial types of clinical studies as well. And then finally, the last resource is the National Cancer Institute. They have information to find a clinical trial, which is linked into clinicaltrials.gov, as well as more about clinical trials in general, and then specifics related to specific types of cancer. So I'm sorry I took a little extra time, but thank you for your attention and for having me.